David Holt pushed the mop across the lobby floor with the steady, practiced rhythm of someone who had long grown accustomed to being overlooked. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the low murmur of early arrivals, and the occasional tapping of heels on marble created the soundscape of Whitestone Technologies' office, a world driven by purpose, productivity, and appearances. The lobby, like the company it represented, was pristine. Vast windows framed the skyline, filling the space with pale morning light that softened the edges of the sleek furniture and polished chrome accents. If success had a look, this was it, the kind of place where confidence carried more weight than kindness and first impressions often became lasting judgments. David blended into this world like a shadow, a man both present and absent. His janitor's uniform, slightly faded at the cuffs, signaled his place in the building's quiet hierarchy. He wore it without shame. It was clean, functional. What mattered wasn't how he looked but how he worked. His shoes whispered against the floor, each step purposeful yet silent, his mop gliding across the marble as if smoothing the surface of a pond. Occasionally, someone entered the building, their shoes loud and their posture purposeful. The executives walked with an air of certainty, cradling coffee cups in one hand and clutching sleek briefcases in the other. They glanced at David, or rather, they glanced through him. To them, he was not a man but a fixture, part of the landscape, like the artful planters by the window or the faint scent of eucalyptus lingering in the air. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut through the hum of the lobby. David looked up, meeting the gaze of a young man who had already begun walking away. A name tag gleamed from his tailored suit, Travis Denton. "You missed a spot," Travis said over his shoulder, not bothering to point or wait for acknowledgement. David didn't respond. He didn't sign or bristle, though his broad shoulders tensed for half a moment. Instead, he simply turned his mop, gliding it once more over the same section of the floor. A spot's a spot, he thought. Nothing more, nothing less. Travis and his entourage breezed through the lobby, their laughter echoing faintly behind them. Travis was young, mid-30s at most, his sharp haircut and crisp suit the kind that belonged to someone climbing fast. David noticed how Travis led the conversation. His voice confident, assured, the kind of tone that brooked no argument. But beneath the bravado, there was something familiar, something David had seen many times before, an eagerness to be important, a need to be seen. David, meanwhile, was content to go unseen. He made his way to the far end of the lobby, where the morning light pooled like gold on the tiles. For a brief moment, he paused, taking in the city beyond the glass. The skyline stretched out like a promise, opportunity and ambition woven into the steel and glass of buildings that rose and towered over streets filled with hurried lives. A voice nearby broke his reverie. "Must be nice, huh?" It was Travis again. He stood just a few feet away, talking loudly enough to ensure David could hear. No pressure, no deadlines, just mop, rinse, repeat. "Wish I could get paid to clean up someone else's mess." The group of employees laughed softly, more out of obligation than amusement. Travis grinned, clearly pleased with himself. He turned back to his colleagues, already shifting the conversation toward a meeting he claimed would make or break the quarter. David said nothing. His expression remained calm, almost placid, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, something unspoken. He kept his movements measured, returning his mop to the bucket and wringing it out with care. People like Travis often mistook silence for submission. But David's silence was not empty. It was watchful, deliberate. He pushed the cart toward the janitor's closet at the end of the hall. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a cramped, windowless space filled with shelves of neatly arranged supplies. David closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. The air here was quieter, less charged. He pulled a small, well-used phone from his pocket, the screen lighting up with a notification, a meeting confirmation. Board announcement. CEO transition. Monday. David allowed himself the smallest smile. The date was set. Soon enough. This place, this pristine office filled with ambitions and assumptions, would see him in a different light. But for now, he was content to play his part. Slipping the phone back into his pocket, David reached for his cleaning supplies. There was more work to be done. The janitor's closet was dim. But outside the door, the day had begun. Full of people chasing something they couldn't yet name and too many others willing to be left unseen. David emerged once more into the hum of the office. A quiet man with a mop in his hand and a secret waiting just beneath his calm, steady surface. The break room at Whitestone Technologies was, in many ways, its own little universe. Here, the ambition of the sleek boardrooms gave way to conversations laced with idle complaints, forced laughter, and whispered alliances. It was a space where employees exhaled, if only for a moment, before returning to their desks, resumes of power and confidence intact. David Holt entered quietly, pushing his cleaning cart against the far wall. The room smelled of burnt coffee and microwaved leftovers, the kind of scent that belonged in places where people worked too hard and ate too quickly. David began wiping the counters, careful not to interrupt the small group gathered at the center table. 3 employees sat huddled over their styrofoam cups, their words weaving through the hum of the refrigerator. One of them, Travis Denton, was talking again, his voice clear and confident as always. A voice that carried authority even when it didn't deserve it. "Did you hear?" Travis said, leaning back in his chair like a man at the top of his game. "The new CEO's announcement is next week. A real hard nose. I heard, from what people are saying. He's been in the industry forever. One of those, started in the mailroom, types. I think he's got something to prove." The others, 2 junior executives, nodded. One of them, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Claire, shifted uncomfortably. "I just hope he's fair," she said softly. "We've had enough shakeups already." Travis scoffed. "Fair doesn't make money, Claire. Results make money. It's like I said yesterday. Some people just can't keep up. Look at him." He jerked his chin in David's direction, not bothering to lower his voice. "The janitors probably got it made. No pressure. No stress. If he screws up, no one even notices." David didn't react, not visibly. His hands kept moving, wringing out a cloth, wiping down the edge of the counter. To someone watching, he might have looked like he wasn't listening at all. But he was. He heard every word. Words like those, words that dismissed someone's worth without even knowing their name, had a weight to them. A weight that settled heavy on the people they were aimed at. Claire glanced in David's direction, her brow furrowing slightly as if she wanted to say something. But she didn't. Instead, she looked down into her coffee, stirring it with a thin plastic stick. "Don't worry," Travis added, clearly sensing the discomfort. "The new CEO's going to take one look at me and know who's carrying the load around here. Guys like that? They know talent when they see it." David finished with the counter, his movements unhurried. He picked up the trash bag, knotted it at the top, and moved toward the door. As he passed the table, Claire looked up briefly, her expression uncertain, almost apologetic. David caught her eye and offered a small, polite nod before stepping out of the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The hallway was quieter. David paused just outside the break room door, the bag of trash in his hand. For a moment, he stood still, feeling the weight of the conversation settle around him like the air in an empty room. He wasn't surprised by men like Travis. He had seen them many times before, young, confident, ambitious. They believed the world was theirs because it had always been that way. They walked with a sense of ownership that came from never having been questioned or dismissed, never having to justify why they belonged. And they assumed, without pause, that those who cleaned their floors or emptied their trash had nothing more to offer than the task at hand. It wasn't the words that bothered David. He was long past being angered by the likes of Travis. It was the ease with which those words were spoken. As if people like him, janitors, drivers, waiters, existed outside the borders of what mattered. The assumption of smallness, the disregard of dignity. He walked toward the back entrance of the building, where the dumpsters waited, his footsteps steady on the tiled floor. The weight of the bag wasn't much. A little heavier than usual. Maybe, but manageable. Years ago, David had learned not to let bitterness make the work harder than it needed to be. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. The city loomed tall around the building, its windows reflecting pale streaks of morning light. David tossed the trash into the bin and paused for a moment. Breathing in the chill, he looked back toward the building. Toward the windows where lights were flickering on one by one. Floors of offices filled with people working hard to be seen. To matter. David knew how it felt to want those things. Once, a lifetime ago, he had been one of them. By mid-morning, David was back in the lobby. The floor polished to a mirror-like shine. The sunlight pouring through the windows made the marble look almost liquid. As if it could ripple beneath a person's feet. Travis walked through again, this time on his own. His phone in hand, thumbs flying as he tapped out messages. He nearly collided with David, stopping just short as if surprised to find someone in his path. "Careful there," he said, his tone clipped. "This isn't the time to stand around." David stepped back quietly, the mop steady in his hand. "Excuse me, sir," he replied, his voice soft but even. Travis didn't respond. He was already moving again. The sound of his footsteps receding down the hallway. David watched him go, his expression unreadable. Moments like these didn't surprise him. They didn't wound him, not anymore, but they lingered, like ripples in still water, revealing the truth of a place. And the truth here was clear enough. That afternoon, David sat alone in the janitor's closet. His lunch spread out on an upturned bucket. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper. A thermos of tea. The room was small, almost suffocating, but it was quiet, and the quiet was a welcome thing. His phone buzzed softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. The screen lighting up with a single line of text. "Are you ready for Monday?" David looked at it for a long moment, his lips pressing into a faint smile. He typed back a single word, "Yes." Tucking the phone away, David took a sip of tea, the warmth spreading through him. Monday would come soon enough. For now, there was work to do. Work he intended to do well. He picked up his mop and stepped back into the hall. The quiet hum of Whitestone Technologies awaited him, a place full of people who still didn't know what was coming. The sound of laughter carried down the hall, muffled slightly by the thick walls and closed doors of Whitestone Technologies. David Holt moved through the corridor, his cart gliding alongside him, the rubber wheels barely making a sound. The executive floor had a stillness about it, a certain quiet that hinted at exclusivity, like the world had been paused, waiting for only a select few to move forward. It was early afternoon, the light outside a little harsher now as it poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, angular shadows on the polished floors. A small meeting had just let out, and a cluster of executives lingered in the hallway, their voices a low hum of conversation. David paused at a corner, unseen and unacknowledged as usual, quietly observing the scene as he filled a mop bucket with water. Travis Denton was at the center of the group, as always, standing just a little taller, speaking just a little louder. He wore confidence like a tailored suit, every detail meant to declare his importance. "If you ask me," he was saying, "we need fewer weak links dragging the rest of us down. That's the first thing the new CEO should focus on." There were murmurs of agreement, though muted, as if the others were careful not to sound too eager. Travis was the type of man people nodded to whether they agreed or not. "And you know where it starts?" Travis continued, tilting his head toward one of the junior executives, his voice lowering just enough to seem conspiratorial. "The ones we never think about. Half these people barely deserve to be in the building. You know them. How many promotions get blocked because someone's playing charity?" A few uncomfortable chuckles. Someone shifted their weight, looking away toward the window. Another glanced down at the watch on his wrist. No one spoke up. David's hand stilled on the mop handle, his expression unreadable. He didn't need Travis to explain who they referred to. He had spent a lifetime being part of them. The ones too often dismissed. The ones forced to prove their worth over and over again because their presence wasn't assumed, but questioned. David didn't interrupt. He never did. Instead, he quietly pushed his cart forward, stepping past the group. They stopped laughing as he passed, an awkward silence settling over them for a fleeting second before Travis, ever quick to recover, cleared his throat. "Make sure you get the boardroom next," he said, his voice sharp but careless. "We don't need clients seeing yesterday's crumbs." "Of course, sir," David replied softly, glancing up just long enough to meet Travis's gaze. There was nothing confrontational in his tone or posture, just calm, measured deference. Yet for a fraction of a second, something shifted in Travis's expression. Confusion, maybe, or discomfort. The moment passed quickly. The boardroom sat empty when David arrived, the heavy mahogany table reflecting the soft afternoon light. He set down his bucket and supplies, quietly moving through the space. Outside the windows, the city hummed with life. Cars threading through traffic. Pedestrians flowing across sidewalks like water finding its path. The room itself was immaculate. But David knew better than anyone that perfection was often a surface thing. He wiped the table slowly, moving from one end to the other. The boardroom was the heart of the company's power, a place where decisions were made, careers were shaped, and futures were written. And yet, here he was, a man no one noticed, cleaning up the crumbs left behind by people who thought him insignificant. David glanced at the chairs, imagining the men and women who sat in them, their voices measured and confident as they steered the company toward its future. In this room, decisions came with weight, with authority. Yet how often did they consider those at the bottom? Those who, like David, worked unseen to hold everything together? The rag in his hand stilled for a moment. He thought back to his earlier years, when he had been part of these rooms. A voice at the table rather than an invisible figure in the shadows. He had worn the same suits, spoken with the same authority, and seen the same glances passed over others who looked like him. It was not bitterness that filled David now, it was clarity. The passage of time had softened his anger, but it had not dulled his awareness. He had seen the cycle repeat itself too many times. People like Travis, who believed worth came only with titles and power. And those like Claire, who questioned but never spoke up. Later that afternoon, David was back in the lobby, buffing the floors while the office emptied for the day. Employees moved toward the elevators in twos and threes, their conversations fading into the quiet hum of the building. Claire passed him on her way out, a coffee cup in hand. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze lingering on him as if she wanted to say something. Finally, she offered a small smile. Good night, ma'am," David replied, dipping his head respectfully. She left quickly after that, her footsteps echoing faintly against the marble. It wasn't much, just 2 words, but David noticed. He noticed the difference between her glance and Travis's sneer, the contrast between indifference and acknowledgement. To someone else, it might not have mattered, but to David, small things carried weight. They always had. When the last elevator doors slid shut, David leaned against the mop handle for a moment, surveying the empty lobby. The space was silent now, save for the faint hum of the city outside. In a few days, the board would make its announcement. The world of Whitestone Technologies. So meticulously ordered, so unaware of the fractures beneath its surface. Was about to change. For now, David remained the janitor, the invisible man cleaning the floors of a building where assumptions mattered more than truths. He let them believe what they wanted to believe. He had learned long ago that sometimes the quietest man in the room was the one who saw the most. And David saw everything. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and David Holt stepped inside, his mop cart wheeling behind him. The day had worn on, and the usual hum of office activity was fading into the soft murmur of conversation as employees began to leave for lunch. The floors of Whitestone Technologies gleamed, as they always did, each corner sharp, each surface polished, a reflection of the company's carefully crafted image. David, as usual, was just another part of the background, another figure who made the place run, unnoticed and unremarkable. He had long since come to accept it. There was comfort in the rhythm of his work. The way the days followed one another, predictable and steady, but even in the quiet, David noticed things he always had. The young executives, for example, who walked past him as though he were invisible. Travis Denton, leading the pack with his well-tailored suit and that unmistakable air of entitlement. No one ever questioned the assumption that men like Travis would ascend to the top, while people like David would remain behind the scenes, cleaning up after their messes. David finished cleaning the lobby floor and set the mop in its bucket. He paused briefly, his eyes drifting to the towering glass building outside. The city stretched beneath him, a landscape full of ambition and pride. The world outside was moving at a pace that felt foreign, even though he had been a part of it once. It was a long time ago now, before the years and the disillusionment had dimmed the fire that had once driven him. He had worked his way up, too, once upon a time. But life had a way of shifting things. He had learned that quickly. The distant hum of the office continued as he moved toward the back corridors. The cleaning supplies in his hand as familiar as the day he first arrived. It wasn't a difficult job. Not really, but it was a job that had its place. And David knew that his place had always been at the bottom. His role, the one he'd chosen, was one that carried with it a certain kind of quiet humility. At least, that's what he told himself. No matter how often the sting of being overlooked prickled at his skin. He knew better than to let it show. It was easier that way. To let the world move around him while he kept to the corners. But the corner was where he had learned to see things most clearly. As he passed one of the executive offices, he overheard a conversation. One that made him stop. It wasn't loud, it was just a few whispers, caught between the hum of the fluorescent lights and the steady tapping of keyboards. "I heard the new CEO's been lurking around for months," one of the voices said, its tone low but full of suspicion. "He's been checking up on us, watching from the sidelines. People think he's already made up his mind about who stays and who goes." "Yeah, and who's he really? Some big shot from Silicon Valley or something?" the second voice responded. A hint of sarcasm creeping in. "I bet he's just some corporate robot with no real understanding of the people here." David's hand stilled for a moment as he cleaned a nearby window. His ear attuned to their words. They spoke of change. Of someone new in charge, a man who was about to take control of a place that had always been run a certain way. What they didn't know, of course, was that the person they were dismissing, the one they were speculating about with their whispered judgments, was standing just a few feet away. He wasn't bothered by their words. Not truly, but they were a reminder of how little they knew, of how quickly people were willing to pass judgment on others. It wasn't just about his job as a janitor, it was about the assumptions that came with it. The belief that someone in his position was simply there to clean, to fade into the background, to remain invisible. David had seen that look on people's faces too many times to count. That subtle glance, the slight pause in a conversation, the dismissive tone that was almost too quiet to notice. They didn't think he mattered. And yet, they were wrong. As the day wore on, David continued his work. The office spaces filled and emptied. The ebb and flow of activity constant. The executives carried on with their discussions, unaware of the shift that was about to come. Travis Denton walked past again, this time with an even sharper air of confidence, his footsteps loud on the polished floors. But this time, David didn't look away. Instead, he took a deep breath and continued his task. Methodically, purposefully, as if nothing had changed. He had learned to keep his thoughts to himself, to blend into the fabric of the company in a way that no one would ever notice. He did his job well. As expected, he was efficient, silent, but in the back of his mind, something was changing. The moment of invisibility he had accepted so easily was starting to feel like something more, a quiet strength. David had a purpose, and soon, the world of Whitestone Technologies would know it. But until that time came, he remained the same, a janitor with a mop, silently watching as the world continued on, unaware of what was about to unfold. Later that evening, as the office began to empty for the night, David made his way back to the janitor's closet, his heart a little heavier than before. The meeting will be soon. The time was coming when his quiet presence would no longer be enough. There was a shift in the air. Something tangible now. Something he couldn't ignore. Change was not just on the horizon. It was already here. Moving silently, just beneath the surface. The elevator dinged as it reached the executive floor, its soft chime almost swallowed by the low murmur of office chatter. David Holt, still in his janitor's uniform, stepped out quietly, his cart trailing behind him. The bustling atmosphere of the office had settled into a steady rhythm as employees prepared for the day ahead. The hum of keyboards, the flicker of monitors, the shuffle of papers, These sounds, familiar now, were the soundtrack to David's daily routine. He moved methodically, passing through the maze of cubicles, past the sleek offices where the real decisions were made, unnoticed and unfazed. It had been a week since the conversation he overheard about the new CEO. The speculation that filled the air like a murmur in the background. People whispered about his identity, his style, the changes he might bring. David could hear it all, as he always did, moving through the spaces that others barely noticed. He had learned, over time, that people spoke their truths when they thought no one was listening. And David listened. He had learned to read the undercurrents of conversations. The subtle shifts in tone. The quiet judgments. The assumptions tucked between words. "Have you heard?" one of the junior executives had asked the day before. "The new CEO's already here. Checking everything. He's been watching us." Another had replied, their voice laced with skepticism. "I heard he's just a ghost in the halls. No one knows who he is. But everyone's talking about him. He's probably just another corporate suit trying to run this place like a machine." David had been just down the hall, cleaning the glass that framed the view of the city. The words hung in the air, a reflection of what people thought and what they failed to see. They assumed the new CEO was someone distant, someone whose presence could be ignored as easily as a name on a board. But the truth was different. David knew that. He knew the company from the ground up. Not just from the polished boardrooms or the glossy quarterly reports. He saw the small things. The unnoticed moments. The way people looked away when they passed him in the hall. The dismissive chuckles when he was too far from their world to matter. He had seen the cracks in the structure that no one spoke of, subtle, quiet fractures that had been there long before he'd taken the job as a janitor. As he moved through the hallway, his cart swishing quietly behind him, David caught sight of Tommy Marshall, the young, ambitious executive who had made his opinions known on more than one occasion. Tommy was walking with two other managers, their steps quick, their voices louder than they needed to be. They were discussing the company's future, the upcoming announcement of the new CEO. David paused for a moment, his hand resting on the mop handle. He didn't look at them directly, but he could hear every word they said. "Whoever this CEO is, I'll tell you one thing." Tommy's voice carried through the hallway, laced with his usual air of superiority. "He's going to have to earn my respect. People like me don't just fall in line. I've worked hard for everything I've got." One of the other managers, a man in his late 30s, nodded. "Yeah, we all have. And no one's going to walk in here and start making demands." David listened, noting the underlying arrogance in their voices. The quiet assumption that they were entitled to what they had, and that they deserved it without question. It wasn't the words that bothered him, it was the certainty with which they spoke. The belief that their worth was unquestionable, that it was a result of their hard work alone, without recognizing the contributions of others. David finished cleaning the floor in silence, his movements deliberate. As he worked, he couldn't help but think of the irony. These executives so sure of their place in the company had no idea who David really was. They didn't know his past, the path he had taken, the choices he had made. They had no idea how many doors had opened for people like Tommy. Doors that had never even appeared for someone like him. By lunchtime, the office was quieter. The voices that had filled the air earlier had softened, replaced by the rustle of papers and the occasional sound of chairs shifting. David was finishing up in the break room, wiping down the counter. He had seen most of the employees pass through, grabbing their lunches and heading back to their desks. It was then that Claire, one of the junior managers who had always greeted him with a polite smile, walked in. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and she hesitated, as if uncertain about something. David didn't say anything, just continued with his task, wiping down the counter in slow, steady motions. "Hey, David," she said after a moment, her voice a little more hesitant than usual. "How's your day going?" David paused for a moment, looking up. There was a softness in her tone, something almost apologetic, as if she wanted to say more but wasn't sure how. "It's going well," he replied quietly, offering her a polite smile. She nodded, looking down at her phone. There was a brief silence before she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. I just wanted to say, thank you, for everything you do around here. I know we all get caught up in our work. But, I see you, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. David's smile softened, though he said nothing. It wasn't the kind of recognition he expected. But it was the kind that meant something. Claire was one of the few who saw beyond the surface. In a world where people often passed by without a second thought. Her words felt like a small, yet significant gesture. As Claire left the break room, David turned back to his work. The familiar rhythm of cleaning once again grounding him. But there was something different in the air now. Something subtle. A shift. Perhaps. He didn't know if it was hope or something else. But it was there. Just beneath the surface. Like a quiet current that had begun to move. Gently. Steadily. Beneath the calm exterior. And as he finished his shift and made his way to the janitor's closet, David knew that the change was coming. It wasn't going to be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet, like everything else in his life had been. But it would be undeniable. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the executive suite, casting narrow strips of light on the polished floors of Whitestone Technologies. The office was quiet. Quiet in a way that suggested anticipation. Though no one would openly admit to it, employees passed by in muted conversation. But there was a subtle undercurrent in the air. Today, something felt different. David Holt, as usual, moved through the hallways with deliberate calm, his cart trailing quietly behind him. His role, his identity, remained unchanged in the eyes of those who passed him by. An invisible presence. An afterthought in the bustling world of high stakes and deadlines. He had long accepted this. Not because he wanted to, but because it was the way of things. People like him, they simply weren't meant to be seen. Yet, despite this quiet, predictable rhythm, there was something that had shifted over the past few weeks. Perhaps it was the lingering whispers about the new CEO. The man who had been quietly making his presence known among the employees. David could sense the undercurrent of nervous energy that had begun to seep into the building. Even though no one would admit it out loud, he had listened, as he always did, to the small conversations held behind closed doors. In corners where no one imagined he would overhear. He had heard the doubts, the discomfort. The executives, with their neatly pressed suits and designer watches, spoke in tones laced with both excitement and fear. "You think this guy knows what he's doing?" one of them had said just the other day. His voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we've got a good thing going here. What if he tries to change everything?" "Yeah," came the response. "I don't know. I've heard he's been observing us. Watching how we interact. I heard he's no fool." David didn't need to be told twice. The tension was palpable, though it remained cloaked beneath layers of corporate jargon and optimistic smiles. It was the quietest moments that revealed the truth. When no one thought anyone was listening. When the doors were closed and the world beyond the walls didn't matter. That was when the truth was spoken. And in those moments, David heard it all. The day continued as normal. The rhythm of work and responsibility carrying on. David cleaned the executive suites, tidied the break rooms, and watched the employees move around, just as he had for the past few months. As the afternoon passed, the building seemed to quieten once more. It wasn't until later, when the sun began to dip below the horizon and the office started to empty, that something different finally happened. David finished his tasks and began to gather his supplies. He didn't rush, he never did. As he made his way down the hallway, he noticed Claire, one of the junior managers, lingering by the coffee station. She was staring out the window, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the counter. David approached quietly, not intending to disturb her. But she noticed him anyway. Without turning, she spoke softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different?" David paused, unsure of what to say. He had never been one to ask too many questions or engage in idle conversation. But there was something in her voice that felt different. More human, more raw. "Different?" David repeated, his voice steady. She nodded slightly, still not looking at him. "I mean, the way things are here. The way people look at us. Like we don't matter. You know?" David had seen this before. The subtle cracks in the surface. People who, like Claire, had begun to see the world around them for what it was. He had watched as more and more of the younger employees began to realize the truth. But they weren't always sure what to do with it. It's how it always is, David said after a pause. The way people see you, or don't see you, I suppose. His voice was calm, not bitter. It wasn't that he didn't feel the weight of it. He had just learned to live with it, to accept it. It wasn't new to him. Claire finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the answer to a question she had never dared to ask. How do you do it? How do you just go along with it? David considered her words for a moment. Watching her, she had asked the question because she wasn't sure of the answer herself. But David knew. He had lived it long enough to understand. I don't know, he said quietly. You do what you can. When you can. But you don't get caught up in what you can't change. You just. He trailed off, letting the silence settle between them. You keep moving, that's all. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. I guess I'll keep moving, too. David gave her a small smile. One that was almost imperceptible but meaningful nonetheless. That's all any of us can do. Later that evening, after the building had emptied, David found himself back in the janitor's closet. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps from the far end of the hallway as the last few employees made their way out. He set his cleaning supplies down and stood for a moment in the quiet, letting the solitude wash over him. Tomorrow, things will begin to change. He could feel it in his bones. A slow shift. The kind of change that comes when people have waited too long to address the truth. He didn't need to rush, to force anything. The shift was already underway. And soon, it would be undeniable. But tonight, there was only quiet, the hum of the air conditioning, the far-off noise of the city, and the steady rhythm of his own breath. David Holt had learned long ago that the world never changed all at once. Change came in small, subtle moments. It came in the conversations no one else heard. In the spaces where people like him existed. Unnoticed. He had learned to wait. And now, it was time. The world would finally see what had always been right in front of them. The morning was still, the air thick with the promise of another busy day. The large glass windows of Whitestone Technologies reflected the sunlight in sharp angles, casting long shadows across the quiet lobby. Inside, the hum of machinery and the soft buzz of office chatter started to fill the space. But there was an undercurrent today, a quiet tension that ran beneath the surface. David Holt moved through the lobby with the same steady rhythm he had carried for months. His mop swept back and forth with the ease of routine. Each stroke calculated, each motion deliberate. He had become an expert at blending in, at becoming part of the background. It was a skill, he thought, that most people took for granted. People like him, people who had learned to go unnoticed, became invisible by default. But today, something was different. There was a subtle shift in the air, an intangible awareness that hovered like a shadow. It was in the way people spoke, more carefully, more guarded. It was in the way they moved, their pace just a little quicker, their gazes darting just a little more often. The new CEO was no longer a rumor, a nameless figure discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors. The time had come for the world to know who he really was. David had kept quiet for so long, observing the way things worked in the office. He had watched the subtle hierarchy unfold, seen the way employees interacted with each other. The executives, with their sharp suits and self-assured postures, had little patience for the help. The younger employees, eager to make their mark, often spoke as though they were the future of the company, careless in their words, dismissive in their actions. But it wasn't just the younger ones. It was ingrained in the culture of the company. This assumption that those who cleaned the floors, took out the trash, and kept things running smoothly were invisible. They were not worthy of attention. They were part of the machinery, not the people. David paused for a moment by the windows, allowing himself a brief moment to breathe. The company, its polished floors and sleek designs, was a reflection of ambition. Yes. But it was also a reflection of something else. A world built on the belief that some people mattered more than others. It was a belief David had lived with for years. He knew it intimately, had seen it in every glance, in every conversation. It wasn't always loud. It wasn't always obvious. But it was there, lurking beneath the surface. As he moved down the hallway, he passed a group of executives talking among themselves. Travis Denton, the youngest of them, led the conversation with his usual air of authority, his words punctuated by dismissive laughs. Honestly, it's about time the CEO steps in, Travis was saying, his tone brimming with condescension. There's been too much complacency around here. This company needs a shake-up. People like me, we're the ones who actually make things happen. You know? The others nodded, some laughing along, but there was an edge to the conversation. Something beneath the surface that David could feel. He knew these kinds of exchanges. Words meant to mask deeper truths. People like Travis, confident in their position, often forgot the effort and care that went unnoticed. They had a tendency to speak as though their success was something inevitable. Something deserved, as if they were born to lead and everyone else, by virtue of their position, existed only to serve them. David kept his head down, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. He had heard enough of these conversations to understand the tone, the unspoken hierarchy that divided the workers from the executives. To many, he was a shadow. To them, he was no different than the broom he carried, the rag he wiped with. And for the most part, David accepted that. But as the whispers continued, he felt something stir in him, a quiet sense of purpose. The day stretched on, and the tension in the air seemed to grow with every passing hour. David moved through the office with the ease of someone who had learned to navigate unnoticed. He took the long hallways, the back rooms, the spaces where people didn't usually look. He cleaned, tidied, and observed. He saw the way people walked past him, too absorbed in their own worlds to take notice. He saw the way they interacted with each other, sometimes cordial, sometimes dismissive, but always underlined with an unspoken rule. Some people, in this place, mattered more than others. But David was not part of that unspoken world. Not today. Today, he had his own role to play. As the afternoon waned, the office began to empty, the usual noise of phones and keyboards quieting as employees left for the evening. David finished his last rounds, wiping down surfaces with the same measured precision he had always employed. But this time, as he moved through the executive offices, there was an unusual stillness in the air. It wasn't just the absence of people. It was the absence of something else. As he passed one of the glass offices, he noticed a small gathering. The executives, Tommy included, were there, their voices hushed now, the words exchanged between them a little more guarded. David did not stop to listen, he simply observed. They spoke of the new CEO, of what he might do, of what he had already done. The tone in their voices had shifted, no longer filled with the casual confidence of those who assumed the world would bend to them, but instead, tinged with uncertainty. David's heart beat steadily as he moved on, his mop trailing behind him. There was no need to rush. He had seen this before. The executives were beginning to realize that their world, the world they had built so carefully, was about to change. They had always assumed they were untouchable, their power absolute. But David had spent months watching, learning, and understanding the very structure of their empire. He knew it better than anyone. And soon, they would learn that too. As David finished his shift and made his way back to the janitor's closet, he could hear the quiet discussions continuing in the distance. There was a murmur of voices from the break room, a few hurried words exchanged in the hall. The tension in the building was palpable now. But it wasn't just about the new CEO. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. David paused at the door to the janitor's closet. He stood there for a moment, just listening to the quiet buzz of the building, the sounds of people moving about, all unaware of what was about to happen. He had always believed in the power of quiet moments, of the unnoticed spaces where truth could be found. And in that quiet, he understood something fundamental. The world had always been more fragile than people realized. The changes that were coming weren't just about leadership or power. They were about the very fabric of the company. They were about recognizing the truth that had always been present but ignored. And tomorrow, the world will finally see it. The office was quiet when David Holt arrived the next morning. A stillness in the air that had yet to break. The early light from the windows filled the space with a soft almost ethereal glow. David moved through the lobby. His steps steady and measured. His cart rolling quietly behind him. He didn't look up. Didn't seek anyone's gaze. It had always been this way. He was part of the background. A constant yet unseen presence. The floors were always clean. The trash emptied without a word. And the air of expectation in the office remained unchanged. Yet, today, something was different. A subtle shift had taken place overnight. The air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. It wasn't something spoken aloud. Not yet, but it was there. In the way people moved. The way they spoke just a little softer. The way their eyes lingered for a moment longer than usual. David noticed it all. The quiet tension that marked the beginning of what was to come. It had been building for weeks now. Under the surface. And today would be the day it finally broke through. As David made his way down the familiar hallway, the low hum of the office buzzed around him. The clattering of keyboards, the shuffle of papers, and the distant murmur of conversations filled the space. But it was all just background noise. David focused on his task, wiping down surfaces, adjusting the carts, and listening. He had learned long ago that the most telling things were not said outright but were felt in the gaps. In the moments of silence between words. He couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of conversations as he moved through the building. Words about the new CEO filled the air. But this time, they were laced with something else: uncertainty, fear, and curiosity. "I heard the new CEO is here. Officially," one voice said, its tone filled with a mixture of disbelief and disbelief. "They're saying he's been watching us for weeks. I didn't know it was him." Another voice, slightly higher, spoke with a nervous laugh. "I heard he's just one of us. He's been on the floors, working alongside the janitorial staff." There was a quiet pause, followed by a soft chuckle. But it quickly faltered. David kept moving, pretending not to hear, but inside, he felt the stirrings of something deeper. It wasn't just a matter of who had seen him working. It wasn't even about the new CEO's identity, which had become the subject of so much speculation. What was unfolding, slowly but surely, was a shift in perception. The company, the employees, were beginning to realize the depth of what they had overlooked. How easy it was to ignore someone based on their role, their appearance, their place in the office. David had been invisible to them for so long. But now, as the whispers circulated, he was becoming something else, something they would no longer be able to ignore. By midday, the news had spread throughout the office like wildfire. There was no denying it anymore. The janitor who had blended into the background for so long was, in fact, the new CEO. The revelation had hit like a quiet storm. David had watched the change unfold in the smallest of ways. A slight hesitation as people passed him in the halls. A fleeting moment where someone's eyes lingered too long. They had seen him all along. But they hadn't truly seen him. Not until today. It was in the lunchroom that the realization seemed to settle into place. The small room, usually filled with idle chatter, had become the center of the office's buzz. David stood in the corner, cleaning, as always, but now, his presence was more pronounced. More felt than it had ever been before. The conversations had slowed, the words hesitated, and every now and then, someone would glance at him, their faces briefly painted with confusion, then quickly masked with something else, something like understanding. Tommy Marshall, the rising star of the company, had been among the loudest voices in the building. David had heard him, time and again, as he made his way through the halls. He had seen Tommy sneer at the work of the janitors, belittle them with the casual ease that came with his sense of superiority. But today, Tommy had become quiet. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a more tentative step, as though he, too, could feel the weight of the moment. David glanced over at Tommy, catching his eye for a brief moment. Tommy stiffened but said nothing. The exchange was brief, just long enough for David to see the flicker of realization behind Tommy's eyes. It wasn't about the position, the power, or the title anymore. It was about something deeper. The understanding that people like David, the ones who had always been invisible, could no longer be ignored. The day stretched on, and by the time the clock struck 5, David was standing outside the boardroom, ready to make his entrance. The room was filled with the usual suspects, the executives, the managers, the ones who had climbed their way to the top, all gathered together in anticipation of what was to come. But today, it was different. Today, the people who had once ignored him, who had seen him as little more than a figure on the periphery, were now waiting to hear from him. David had made his way to the front of the room, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. The faces around the room were a mix of surprise, confusion, and, for some, perhaps even a touch of fear. They had assumed that someone else, someone more familiar with their world, would stand before them as the new CEO. But instead, it was David, someone they had seen day after day, someone they had written off without a second thought. He cleared his throat, the sound filling the room. "Good evening, everyone," David began, his voice calm, steady. "I imagine many of you have questions. I know this isn't what you expected, but I'm here to tell you that things are going to change." The room was still. No one spoke. David let the words settle before continuing. "I've spent the last few months with all of you, working alongside you, seeing how things really work in this company. What I've seen isn't just about the work we do, it's about the way we treat each other. And that has to change. The truth is, it's not just about titles and positions, it's about recognizing the value of every single person in this building. Everyone has a role to play, whether it's in the boardroom, the break room, or the hallways." David paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had so often turned away from him. He could feel their discomfort, their unease. It was not the silence of respect, it was the silence of realization. "It's time for us to reimagine this company," David said, his voice unwavering. "A company where people are valued not just for their titles, but for their contributions, where respect is a given, not something earned. We will not tolerate the divisions that have existed for so long. We will build a culture that acknowledges every person, no matter their role, no matter their background." David took a deep breath, his next words carrying the weight of everything he had seen and felt over the past months. "And it starts now." The room was still, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. The people who had once dismissed him, the ones who had looked through him without ever truly seeing him, were beginning to understand. The change was not just about the title or the office. It was about the quiet strength that came from within. And the recognition that everyone, regardless of their role, had a part to play in shaping the future. And as David stood there, looking out at the faces in the room, he knew that this moment, this quiet turning point, was just the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was one he was ready to walk.